Have you ever checked your paycheck and wondered, am I making the legal minimum wage? Or asked, has that rate changed recently? It's a fair question, especially with cost of living rising, bills going up, and everyone peeking at whether federal rules keep up. So today we're going to break down exactly what the federal minimum wage is in 2025, what that means for workers, who it applies to, and where state laws may give you more. If you work for a business covered by federal law and you're non-exempt, you deserve to know what your baseline pay should be. Before we dive in, hit subscribe so you'll always stay on top of what the law says about your wages. All right, let's get started. Part 1. The federal minimum wage, the baseline rule. The federal minimum wage is set by the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, a law passed in 1938 during the Great Depression to protect workers from unfair pay. When Congress sets the rate, it becomes the nationwide floor. As of 2025, that rate is still $7.25 per hour, the same number it has been since July 24th, 2009. That means, for more than 15 years, the federal minimum wage has not increased, even though the cost of living has gone up significantly. The FLSA requires that most employees in the United States, especially those working in businesses engaged in interstate commerce or companies with annual sales above $500,000, must receive at least the minimum wage if they are classified as non-exempt. Non-exempt simply means the worker is entitled to both minimum wage and overtime protections. Let's make this practical. Imagine you're a cashier at a large grocery store chain that does business across state lines. You're non-exempt, so federal law guarantees you at least $7.25 an hour, no matter what. Even if your employer tries to argue that times are tough or we don't pay overtime here, the FLSA says otherwise. It's also important to understand that $7.25 is just the federal baseline. States and cities can pass higher minimum wage laws, and in those cases, workers must be paid the higher of the two rates. For example, if you live in Texas, which follows the federal rate, you may still be earning $7.25. But if you live in California, where the state minimum wage is over $15 per hour, your employer must pay that higher rate instead. Another key detail: some categories of workers have different minimum wage rules. For example, tipped employees, certain youth workers, and people with specific disabilities under older provisions may legally be paid a lower direct wage, but even then their total pay, wages plus tips, must equal at least $7.25. So, the baseline rule in 2025 is simple but powerful. If you are a non-exempt worker covered by the FLSA, the federal minimum wage guarantees you at least $7.25 per hour, unless your state or city requires more. Part 2. Who is covered by the minimum wage and who isn't? The federal minimum wage law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, is broad, but it doesn't apply to everyone. To really understand your rights, you have to know who is covered, who isn't, and what special rules exist for certain groups of workers. First, the vast majority of hourly non-exempt employees are covered. If you work in retail, food service, hospitality, warehouses, manufacturing, or almost any business engaged in interstate commerce, or your employer earns more than $500,000 annually, then you're entitled to at least $7.25 per hour under federal law. This applies whether you're part-time or full-time, but there are exceptions. One major group is tipped employees. Federal law allows employers to pay a cash wage as low as $2.13 per hour, as long as tips bring the total up to at least $7.25. If your tips don't cover the gap, your employer must make up the difference. In practice, this rule is often violated and tipped workers are among the most likely to experience wage theft. Some states, like California and Washington, ban this system and require employers to pay tipped workers the full minimum wage in cash on top of tips. Another exception involves young workers. Under the youth minimum wage rule, employees under 20 can be paid as little as $4.25 per hour for their first 90 consecutive days of employment, as long as they are not displacing other workers. After that period, they must receive the full federal minimum wage. There are also special categories under the FLSA for students and learners. Full-time students working in retail or service establishments, agriculture, or colleges can be paid at 85% of the minimum wage under certain Department of Labor certificates. The idea is to give students job opportunities, but critics argue it leaves young workers underpaid. Workers with disabilities used to fall under a separate exemption too. Under Section 14C of the FLSA, employers could apply for special certificates to pay workers with disabilities less than the minimum wage. This practice is being phased out in many states, but it still exists federally. And finally, independent contractors generally aren't covered because the FLSA applies only to employees. But here's the catch: many so-called contractors are misclassified. If your employer controls your schedule, directs your work, and provides your tools, you may legally be an employee, entitled to minimum wage and overtime protections. So, while the $7.25 federal minimum wage looks simple on paper, in reality it comes with layers of exceptions and conditions. The key is knowing which category you fall into. If you're a tipped worker, a student, or someone classified as exempt, your rights may look different. But if you're a typical hourly worker in most industries, the law says you should never earn less than $7.25 per hour, unless your state requires even more. Part 3. Why $7.25 hasn't changed since 2009, and what's being proposed. One of the most striking facts about the federal minimum wage is just how long it's been frozen. The last time Congress raised it was July 24th, 2009, when it moved from $6.55 to $7.25 per hour. That means by 2025, it has stayed exactly the same for more than 15 years. In the meantime, the cost of living has risen sharply. Rent, food, gas, healthcare, and education all cost much more today than they did in 2009. Yet, the minimum wage hasn't budged. Why? The simple answer is politics. Any change to the federal minimum wage requires an act of Congress. Over the years, bills have been introduced, like the Raise the Wage Act, which aimed to gradually lift the wage to $15 or even higher. But none of those proposals passed both houses of Congress. Lawmakers disagree sharply on whether raising the federal minimum wage helps workers or harms businesses. The impact on workers is huge. In 1968, the minimum wage was worth more than $12 an hour in today's dollars, when adjusted for inflation. Today, $7.25 buys far less. That means the real value of minimum wage has eroded dramatically, leaving many workers struggling. A full-time worker at $7.25 earns just over $15,000 a year before taxes, barely enough to cover rent in most cities. Meanwhile, many states and cities have acted on their own. Over 30 states now have minimum wages above $7.25. California's statewide minimum wage is over $16 in 2025, and cities like Seattle and New York City are higher still. This patchwork system means two workers doing the same job in different states can earn vastly different wages. In 2025, the Raise the Wage Act of 2025 was introduced again, this time aiming to raise the federal rate gradually to $17 by 2030. Supporters argue it would lift millions of workers out of poverty. Opponents warn it could increase costs for small businesses and lead to job cuts. As of now, the bill hasn't passed, so the federal rate remains stuck at $7.25. So when people ask why the federal minimum wage hasn't changed, the answer is not because workers don't need it, but because Congress hasn't agreed. Until that happens, the federal minimum wage remains $7.25, making state laws the real drivers of higher pay in much of the country. Part 4. State and local minimum wages. Higher standards across the country. Even though the federal minimum wage has stayed at $7.25 since 2009, many states and cities have chosen to raise their own minimum wages. By 2025, more than 30 states have minimum wages above the federal rate, and in some places, the difference is dramatic. Take California. The statewide minimum wage in 2025 is over $16 per hour, and some cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles set even higher local minimums. That means a worker doing the same job in California earns more than double the federal floor. Washington State is another leader, with a minimum wage above $16 as well, adjusted annually for inflation. New York requires a higher wage too, with New York City and surrounding counties setting their own rates that often exceed $17 per hour. Other examples: Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Oregon, and Colorado have all moved their minimum wages above $15. In fact, $15 has become a symbolic benchmark across the country, thanks to years of advocacy by worker movements like the Fight for $15. Some states tie their minimum wages to inflation or cost of living adjustments. That means the rate automatically rises each year without new legislation. For example, Washington, Oregon, and Arizona adjust annually so that wages keep pace with the Consumer Price Index. This system prevents the erosion of purchasing power that has hurt the federal minimum wage. On the other hand, some states, including Texas, Georgia, and Wyoming, still use the federal $7.25 rate. In Georgia and Wyoming, the official state minimum wage is even lower, $5.15, but because federal law overrides it for covered employees, most workers still receive $7.25. The result is a sharp divide. Depending on where you live, the minimum wage could be anywhere from $7.25 to more than $17 an hour. Local governments also play a big role. Cities like Seattle, Denver, and Portland have adopted higher local minimums that go beyond their state levels. In many cases, these local increases are designed to reflect the high cost of living in urban areas. What does this mean for workers? Simply put, your location determines your paycheck. Two workers doing the same job, say as a fast food cashier, can have very different earnings depending on whether they're in Texas or California. That's why it's crucial to check not just federal law, but also your state and city laws to know what you're entitled to. So, while the federal minimum wage is still $7.25, the real story is that in most of the country, workers are earning more because states and cities stepped in where Congress did not. Part 5. What to do if you're paid below minimum wage. Knowing the law is one thing, but protecting yourself when your paycheck falls short is another. Unfortunately, wage theft, including failure to pay minimum wage, is one of the most common workplace violations in the U.S. The Department of Labor estimates that billions of dollars are lost every year because workers aren't paid what they're legally owed. So, what can you do if you think you're being paid less than the minimum wage? The first step is to know the correct rate where you live. The federal minimum wage in 2025 is $7.25, but many states and cities have higher rates. If your location requires more, your employer must pay that amount. Check your state's labor department website or the U.S. Department of Labor's wage map for confirmation. Next, keep records, save your pay stubs, note your hourly rate, and write down the hours you work each day. If you're asked to work off the clock, or your employer manipulates timesheets, your personal notes can be vital evidence. Courts have ruled that when employers fail to keep accurate records, as the law requires, an employee's reasonable estimate of hours worked can be accepted. If you find that you're being underpaid, raise the issue with your employer or HR department first. Sometimes errors are clerical and can be fixed quickly. But if your employer refuses or insists their pay practices are correct, you may need to go further. You can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, WHD. They investigate violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act and can recover back wages for employees. Many states also have their own labor boards that enforce higher state minimum wages, often with stronger penalties. For example, in Massachusetts, employers can be ordered to pay triple damages for unpaid wages. Another option is to seek legal help. Many employment lawyers handle wage cases, and some take them on a contingency basis, meaning they only get paid if you recover money. In some states, if you win, the employer has to pay your attorney's fees. Finally, remember, it's illegal for an employer to retaliate against you for asserting your rights. They can't legally fire you, cut your hours, or punish you for filing a complaint. If they do, that creates a second violation, and the penalties can be even greater. The bottom line is this: if you're making less than the minimum wage, you don't have to accept it. The law is on your side, and there are clear steps you can take to claim the pay you've earned. So, what's the bottom line? As of 2025, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 per hour, the same rate it has been since 2009. That number hasn't kept up with inflation, and for many workers, it doesn't cover today's cost of living. But remember, federal law is just the floor. Many states and cities have set higher minimum wages, and if you live in one of those areas, your employer must pay you the higher rate. If you think you're being underpaid, don't ignore it. Keep your records, check your state's laws, and know that you can file a complaint with the Department of Labor or your state labor board. Employers can't legally retaliate against you for standing up for your rights. If this video helped clear things up, hit like, share it with your coworkers, and subscribe for more plain English explanations of workplace laws. And tell me in the comments, what's the minimum wage where you live?